medal is from Korea. My father's name was Ronald Percy Hall. He was at the end of his service, he was an acting chief petty officer, and he passed away in January 2021. So my dad was in the Malayan emergency and the Korean War in active service. He left Australia on the 13th of May 1952 and returned on the 21st of April 1953.
What about before he attended for the war?
Okay, well, Dad grew up in Perth in Western Australia. I know from family stories and history that he loved the beach and he loved the ocean. He used to always, when he had any free time, he would go to the beach on his bike with his brothers and they would spend the day there having a great time, as young kids do in Australia. So I remember asking his sister, one of his sisters anyway, what was Dad like before he went to war, and also one of his brothers, and they said, the sister said he was someone who was always interested in things, pretty intelligent guy. So he liked to teach her things, and the others say he was always a very fun person. He really was a bit of a life and soul of the party sort of person when he was younger. He left school fairly early, I think, about 15 or 16, and started a job with the Western Australian Railways. But I don't think he must have liked that very much. Because he left that and returned to study for a little while. And after that, he joined the Navy. So he joined the Navy from Western Australia and undertook some service. I know he was off the coast of Queensland on ships for a while. And then in 1952-53 went to Korea. That was his first offshore posting. So his job was as a radio communications officer, and so he was on the last ship he was on, he was in charge of communications between the ship and the shore and the ship and other ships. For example, he knew Morse code, so they would often have to use that, I think.
While your father was staying in Philippines after the Korean
War.
War.
Yes.
And your name was after the general's daughter name.
Yeah.
Can you tell me more about it?
And I know that Dad used to sometimes get to go to stay at this man's house, but I don't know how he met them. When there was shore leave, they had the opportunity to go and stay with friends. And this guy had a daughter whose name was Linnell, and it's quite an unusual name. And there are lots of Lynns and lots of Lynnettes, but not many Linnells. But I was named after her.
Do you like your name, Linnell?
Probably not a lot, really. I just say to people, call me Lynn. It's easier for people too, yeah. It's funny, I have tried to find this girl and this man. I don't know his name. All I know is he was in the Philippines. I thought I might find it on the internet, but I've never been able to find out. That when Dad came back from the war, like I said before, he was mentally altered. I don't mean he was stupid in any way. He's a very, very smart man, but he was quite stressed quite a lot of the time, and I was a young girl and I was a bit rebellious. So we didn't get on very well when I was young, when I was a teenager, like a lot of teenagers and their parents. So I left home early because it was a very stressful time for both of us.
So on the age of 55, on your father's age, he got TPI, so he is no longer able to work anymore. So would you describe us what is TPI and what the situation was on that time?
TPI means totally and permanently incapacitated. So that's what the words TPI stand for. So for example, people who were physically very disabled from the war, maybe they had the legs blown off or they had some other very bad physical injury, you can get TPI pension, which means the government will pay your salary for the rest of your life. It also applies for mental health concerns. So of course, he didn't like to talk about that. It was a big secret, really. But over the years, it became clearer and clearer that his mental health had been very badly affected by the war. He had terrible insomnia, he couldn't sleep, he couldn't deal with even something like the television would break down or something, and he would just get so stressed. So things that other people would think were not an issue were a very big issue. So he was what's called pensioned out from the public service. That means they said, you're too sick to work any longer. And so he was paid out on the TPI pension. I mean, he also had physical injury because I told you about the guns going off all night. He was completely deaf. So that was another part of it as well, but it wasn't the major reason that he got TPI.
Met your dad in Singapore while you were traveling around. What did you feel on that time?
Okay. In those days, that was towards the end of when I was young and rebellious. I was starting to grow up, you know. But my dad and I had not been getting on well because of everything I told you before. And there I was sitting in Singapore in Newton Circus with some friends, having some drinks. And I remember looking up and there was this face. I know this person. And it turned out to be my father. And he was travelling in Singapore. Mum wasn't there. And I was speechless. And anyway, so he came and sat down. And I think it was probably the first time we related to each other as adults. And we had a few beers together. After that, it was like it stopped the bad time and we got on really well from then on. And I realised, I think, that actually a lot of the reason that we didn't get on for all that time was because we were so alike. He had a strange habit of, like John and I would be on holidays somewhere in Asia and he wouldn't tell us he was coming, but he would just arrive. And I don't know why. Was it because, I really don't know why. Anyway, we didn't mind, fortunately. We enjoyed him being there. But there were times, I remember one time in Bali, we were sitting there having breakfast and I looked up to the mezzanine floor and there was Dad waving at me. I'm like, what? He kept doing that all the time. He would just, because he loved to be in Asia and Mum didn't. Mum would get an upset stomach from the heat and the food. So she didn't like to go. So I think Dad just, whenever he got the chance, he would come up and join us. Dad, after the war, being quite insular and not wanting to go out much or see people much. It was really strange. He was like a different person when he was in Asia. I think it allowed him to get out of his head, you know, get out of himself and enjoy things. Yeah, he was like just free and loved it there. I often wondered why he didn't live there.
Can you tell me about the major, what you did for a PhD?
Never a quick answer. My PhD basically looked at how people from different cultures learn. So that's it in a short sentence. I'm absolutely convinced that the reason that I ended up being really fascinated by Asia is because I grew up hearing Dad's stories about Asia. Not just Korea, but certainly including Korea. It was hard to get him talking in depth about his war experiences, but he would often say, especially when I was young, and he would tell me often about how he saw the suffering in Korea, particularly of the kids. Yeah, so Dad had a very soft heart for kids, and yeah, he would often talk about that.
As you have seen your father right beside him, other than the one you felt bad to your dad, is there something else you want to talk about your dad?
You know, he was just a young guy doing what was expected of him in those days, and having a good time where he could and putting up with the bad times on the ship and everything. But I think he did come back irreparably damaged from the war. You know, like for example, after my mother passed away, which was about 5 years before Dad passed away, he hardly ever went out of the house. Like he was seriously a recluse. And I couldn't, although you've seen this is a big house, I have so much room. He was asked 1,000,000 times to come and live with us, but he wouldn't. Later in life, society generally started to talk about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and I started to talk to Dad about it and say, look, I think this is what you've got. And eventually, like when he passed away, and I opened one of the cupboards in his bedroom, the whole wall of the cupboard was covered in articles about PTSD. So yeah, I think I would have loved to have known what Dad would have been like if he hadn't been to war. I think he would have been a different person. But also when I say I think he might have been a different person, I feel bad because I don't want him to be a different person. I loved him anyway. And yeah, I loved him the way he was, but I wish for his sake that he didn't have to have the stress that he obviously had.
And we would like to ask you if you have some letters that you want to talk to your dad in the video.
He knows. I think during COVID, a lot of people didn't get to be with their parents when they were sick or dying. I managed to get to be with Dad when he suddenly got very sick, and to sit with him while he was in his last days. And we said a lot of things to each other, so I was very lucky that we got to do that. Yeah, look, I loved him a lot. I admired his service. I'm sorry that he had to suffer with the after effects of the war. I'm sorry I didn't understand him when I was a teenager. I needed to get the perspective of age before I could really understand why he was the way he was. But in the end, he was my best friend. And now I need a tissue. Yeah, Dad also kept photos, but you would understand, I'm sure, I'm very passionate about